Welcome back. I hope you weren't expecting me to do this video in character as the Terminator, because that would be ridiculous even for me. Besides, Catherine is badass enough when it comes to ideas having to do with politics and economics. She opens chapter 4 with a quote from a world-famous, award-winning economist by the name of Milton Friedman, who claimed that the strongest argument in favor of free enterprise, essentially free market economics, is that it prevents anybody from gaining too much power. Well, I would love to give you a whole bunch of quotes from this guy, Milton Friedman, so that you could decide for yourself not only whether or not he's a poster boy for pseudo-intellectual nerds, but also the kind of guy who can justify as true his belief in whatever it is he wants to believe. Psychology true fact. The smarter a person is, the better he or she will be able to justify as true their belief in whatever it is they want to believe. And Milton Friedman was a very smart guy. Catherine goes right into chapter 4, pointing out that if you actually look at the results of the economic system we have, largely based on free market economics, the result is the exact opposite of what Friedman and others like him claim. Instead of preventing anybody from gaining too much power, it has enabled certain individuals and ginormous corporations to gain enormous power. Catherine points out that in terms of economic power, we have corporations bigger than entire nations. And thanks to a long string of Supreme Court decisions, those corporations have been given various human rights, but are protected by law from obligations and accountability expected from American citizens. She goes on to say that with no limits on campaign spending, those corporations can buy our elections legally. This, she says, is not capitalism or democracy. It's insanity. Amen to that, sister. Catherine says she believes in economic freedom, as I would add anybody with any common sense would. Then she makes the important distinction between small mom and pop businesses and even small corporations and the giant corporations that use their concentrated wealth and power to buy off politicians, skate around regulations, abuse their privileges, and sometimes break the laws to win. Hate to tell you this, kids, but if you were ever taught that crime doesn't pay, maybe you'll change your mind when I nerd whisper some books from David K. Johnston. Fact of the matter is, crime actually does pay. Big time. If you're a giant, politically connected American corporation. Next, Catherine points out that these giant corporations have their politicians and their corporate-sponsored citizens groups, like Citizens United, insist that any attempt to further control them is a socialist plot to destroy democratic capitalism. Once again, I would like to point out that the only reason that they can get away with spewing horse crap like that is the fact that the vast majority of Americans don't even know what true Thomas Paine-style democracy is, don't know what true Adam Smith-style capitalism is. Catherine drives the point home by saying, this is not capitalism, it is calculated corporatism. Catherine goes on to say that corporations have enormously benefited America. I would add that corporations are the greatest engines of economic growth and prosperity in the history of the known universe. The problem, as Catherine points out, is that all big corporations have one goal: to make money. Period. They are not in business to do good, to compete fairly, or to benefit the United States or its citizens, unless those citizens happen to be shareholders. She immediately says that if corporations were actual people, they would be considered sociopaths, smart, narcissistic, manipulative, and completely without conscience. As my beloved viewers are aware, Catherine knows a little about sociopaths. Having laid the foundation for understanding what's up with corporations, Catherine next looks at how they got so powerful that they were able to turn what was supposed to be a capitalist economy into what is actually a corporatist economy, because it was not always this way. First of all, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, corporations could not even exist unless they were granted permission to exist by the government, basically by we the people. Catherine says, incorporation was a privilege. It allowed individuals to raise money from investors and pursue expensive, sometimes risky ventures. Things like starting a big mining or oil drilling operation, digging a canal, or building a railroad. That permission to exist was granted in the form of a charter. A charter was kind of like a driver's license in that it was only good for a limited amount of time, only granted limited rights, and required that certain obligations be met. The most important obligation was that the corporation had to be of some benefit to the public. If a corporation did stuff it wasn't supposed to do, it could have its charter revoked, same as your driver's license can be revoked. If it was only making money for its owners but not doing the public any good, its charter might not be renewed when it expired, which is what happened to both the first and second national banks, which were kind of like the Federal Reserve is today, but very different. I will definitely be talking about what nerds call our nation's unofficial fifth branch of government in later videos. This situation where incorporation was a privilege that came with clearly stated rights and obligations, including the obligation to be of some benefit to the public, that all changed. Which brings us to the abomination known as corporate personhood. Catherine only briefly mentions a Supreme Court case known as Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, known amongst nerds and well-informed Americans as the Santa Clara case. Because at this point, she specifically mentions Thom Hartmann's book, Unequal Protection. In my weird mind, that gives me her permission to jump over to his book, to give my beloved viewers a more in-depth story than she gives here. Hope that's cool. Mr. Hartmann begins the story of the Santa Clara case by introducing the main characters. I'm going to start with the lead attorney for Santa Clara County, which is located up around San Francisco. His name was Delphin Delmas, an experienced lawyer who became known as the silver-tongued orator of the West. Relax, ladies, that only meant that he was a passionate speaker. The attorney for the Southern Pacific Railroad was a man by the name of Silas Sanderson. He was a former justice on the California State Supreme Court and a very passionate supporter of the railroads. In fact, he was present when the ceremonial Golden Spike was driven, commemorating the completion of the first transcontinental railroad, and you can see him in famous paintings commemorating that historic event. For over 2 decades, he had made himself rich as an attorney for the nation's largest railroads. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, hearing the Santa Clara case, was a man by the name of Morrison Remick Waite. He was a politician, state politician during his younger years, but had spent most of his career representing the biggest corporations he could find, and made his fame representing the United States government in a lawsuit against the British government for helping to outfit the Confederate Navy with a warship during the Civil War. Next, Mr. Hartmann explains what the case was about. He says it was a simple tax matter having nothing to do with human rights or corporate personhood. In a nutshell, it had to do with the way that the county appraised for tax purposes fencing that ran alongside the railroad tracks through the county. It had nothing to do with the value of the land, the railroad tracks, the train depots, or anything else. Just the tax on the fencing. Because the way that Santa Clara County assessed the value of that fence was different from in other counties, the amount of tax that they said the railroad owed on the fence was higher than in other counties. Well, because the railroad had a bigger agenda than just a few $1,000s in taxes, they refused to pay their entire tax bill for 6 years, forcing Santa Clara County to sue them for back taxes. The fact that the railroad owed all but a tiny fraction of its tax bill was completely undisputed. The railroad's hidden agenda was revealed in the bulk of its argument in front of the court, which was that as a corporate person, it was being treated differently from living, breathing human beings for tax purposes, in violation of the 14th Amendment to our Constitution, which had given recently freed slaves equal rights under the law. The railroad claimed that in being treated differently as a corporate person than a human person, it was the victim of unequal protection under the 14th Amendment. At this point, I should explain that the term corporate person is a business and legal term that dated back centuries before the 1880s when the Santa Clara case was heard. It got established in law to make it clear that a corporation could enter into contracts like a person, or if something went wrong, it could be sued like a person. Now, if that ain't crazy enough, this railroad claiming that the 14th Amendment included equal protection for corporate persons, remember that this was at a time in our nation's history when women were not even considered persons, at least not persons entitled to equal protection under the law. In fact, just a few years before the Santa Clara case, in 1882, I think, the Supreme Court specifically ruled that women were not entitled to equal protection under the 14th Amendment because women had no legal existence separate from their husbands. My beloved female viewers might be thinking the Supreme Court is sometimes called the High Court because them old judges smoked dope. It was a different world back then. The good old days? Not so much. In response to the railroad lawyers' claim that their corporation was a person entitled to the same protection under the 14th Amendment to our Constitution as American citizens, the same protection as God's children, the lawyer for Santa Clara County, Delphin Delmas, was filled with righteous indignation. Mr. Hartmann says, winding himself up into full-throated outrage, Delmas rebuked the railroad's lawyers with a pure and honest fury. I'm sorry, Mr. Hartmann, but I just cannot imagine how a California lawyer looking like this guy could deliver the formally worded quotes you got from him here with pure and honest fury. But I can most definitely imagine how a pissed off old redneck today might say essentially the same thing that way, nerd whisperer style. I'm going to leave off with that as a teaser and launch right into that next time. Should be fun. Hopefully it'll be entertaining as well as informationful. See you then. If you like this video, why not click the like button? I'll put a link to the next episode over here.